Hey everybody, this is Volts for June 4th, 2025. How to reduce the impact of mining. I'm your host, David Roberts. When it comes to the subject of mining and the clean energy economy, it is important to keep two truths in mind at once. First, relative to the fossil-fueled status quo, a clean energy economy will involve vastly less disruption of the Earth's crust via digging, drilling, and mining. The materials that compose clean energy technologies only need to be extracted once. When you build a fossil-fueled machine, you have to keep extracting fuel for it as long as it runs. There's no comparison. That said, it is also the case that clean energy technologies involve much more of certain minerals and metals than fossil energy technologies and will require much more of certain kinds of mining. As listeners surely know, that mining of copper, lithium, rare earth metals, etc., can have extremely damaging social and environmental consequences. Clean energy advocates shouldn't wave those consequences aside or ignore them. They should think about how to reduce them. Obviously, a comprehensive approach to mining will involve social movements and public policy, not just technology, but it's still worth seeking out the technologies that could help. That is what Johanna Wolfson set out to do when she co-founded Azolla Ventures, a VC firm that is distinguished by deploying, in part, philanthropic money for explicitly pro-social purposes. The mining industry is one of Azolla's main targets, so I thought it would be illuminating to talk with Wolfson about the kinds of promising mining tech she is funding and how it might help. All right then. Okay, with no further ado, Johanna Wolfson, welcome to Volts. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. It is awesome to be here.
So we are here to talk about mining, but tell us your life story and how did you end up where you are and where are you? What is it that Azolla does?
So I'm with Azolla Ventures. I'm a co-founder there, and we are bringing a different way of investing forward in climate tech. What makes us unique is we are impact-first investors. That's not because we're, such great people, though we like to believe that. It's really because we aggregate philanthropic tax-exempt capital as the heart and soul of our fund, and that lets us take on outsized risk relative to what other venture funds can and really should do. And it requires that we're impact-first in our mindset and methodology and deployment of capital. And so we're out after big swings in climate and taking on pretty meaningful risks. Most often that means, science and engineering risks. That can also mean market and other sorts of risk. But we've gotten to do some interesting things along the way. And the way I got here was I'm a scientist by training, physical chemistry, and came to think that all the amazing science getting done in lab benches around the world didn't have the right way out. That's not a, original thought, but I really wanted to do something about that and wanted to spend my career on it. And so found my way through working at initially an industry lab, then spent some time at the Department of Energy in DC, getting to know, what government can and can't do, and decided to work on the capital problem for early stage companies, and probably wouldn't have been that compelled to go to an investment firm for its own sake. But the idea to build something different in terms of what types of things we could do and invest in and bring a different model forward was super compelling. So we've been at it for coming up on 8 years now.
This went by really quick, but let me just pull it back up. You are deploying exclusively philanthropic capital?
Not exclusively. So we have built a fund structure that pairs philanthropic capital with more typical impact aligned, but not tax exempt capital. And by drawing on those two different pools side by side, first weighted toward the higher risk, and then later when companies graduate from, that especially high risk zone, pulling on the more conventional capital, we're able to both kind of launch, catalyze, and then scale companies that we partner with.
When I threw this out there online, a lot of people's questions were related to, in one way or another, to how does the VC model line up with this? So there's sort of a broad discussion in our space. I'm sure you've followed it, that like the limitations of the VC model. The VC, they're looking for unicorns, they're looking for 10x, et cetera, and they're looking for relatively quick payouts, whereas lots of infrastructure-y type of things, that type of capital doesn't work well in this type of business. And I would think intuitively that mining is sort of paradigmatically conservative, slow, doing investments that are multi-decadal. You know what I mean? It's like big and conservative and slow. So the match between the VC model and mining is not obvious to me. So maybe talk through a little bit about how you think about that.
Yeah. How long do we have here? Okay. So lots to say there. For one, climate tech generally, yes, absolutely. All of those critiques about venture are true and, make a lot of sense. And yet, over the last 5+ years, a great deal of climate tech capital, as I'm sure you've, covered extensively, has shown up, and some of those sources of capital have more patient structures associated with them. We're the only one I know of that has this tax-exempt philanthropic angle, but lots of them have, longer timelines, so that helps somewhat.
So you, as far as you know, you're the only fund that is doing this blending of philanthropic and private capital?
As far as I know, we're the only fund doing this blending in climate tech at this scale. So there's a couple other kind of smaller, earlier efforts. But yeah, we're a $250 million fund and we'd like to see more. But as of now, not yet. So we do see increasingly more patient capital coming into heavy infrastructure technologies, which you could say about a lot of climate tech, not just mining. On the mining front, all of those challenges are super real. So I could speak, from experience with many of our portfolio companies starting to pilot with mining majors or starting to get out in the field. I mean, it is slow. The challenges are real, not a sector historically known for quick innovation. You can imagine all of the things that make it hard. So those are all true. Over the last couple years, I've actually seen more of our peer investors start to make mining investments. And that is probably driven by a recognition of both the extraordinary need for securing critical materials in light of a coming energy transition, which I'm sure we'll talk more about, coupled with, mining is a pretty stable and reliable sector. And so if you were canvassing across all the different things in clean tech, it's actually, I would argue, one of the more reliable places you could invest. Now, that said, it doesn't make easy any of the challenges around integrating with existing legacy infrastructure or selling to mining majors that, might be fine with the way things are going now. It doesn't make any of those problems go away, but across all the areas that we invest in, some of which are more challenging for VC to engage in, I wouldn't say mining is among the most challenging. Now, the other thing I'll say, just in terms of where we're seeing other capital show up, this is kind of my bugbear issue about clean tech investing in general, is where I really wholeheartedly agree with those questions and maybe the critique that's coming behind them, is that just because you can find technologies or companies to invest in with a venture mindset doesn't mean that you're going after the biggest set of problems that we need for, achieving a clean energy transition. Like, those are two totally different mindsets. And I think the venture community can get caught up in a story that, because I'm able to put together this company markup or this narrative, therefore that, look, venture is working and climate, it's like, well, we're not looking across the broad swath of emission sources.
The worry, I think, is that the set of things that are receiving investment That set is being shaped more by the sort of character of the investors than the shape of the problem. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's the VC susceptible problems
You
that are
can't
getting
see
invested
me,
in.
but I'm like raising my hands in cheer right now that you said that. And this is a whole separate area that I'm looking into and working on with some like-minded colleagues at other places where it's you said it so well. The places where money is going are being shaped by the venture mindset, and we're leaving a lot of impact on the table. And by the way, I'm not supposed to say that as an investor.
Well, I guess my follow-up question is the answer then to broaden the types of things that VCs are comfortable investing in, or is the right answer to bring in other types of funding that aren't VC?
I fall into camp B. I think that you can only push the VC model so far. And that's not because of closed-mindedness or anything. It's because of the type of capital that's being aggregated, the expectations that sit behind that capital, and the nature of running a conventional VC fund, which is, I'm going to go ask these folks for more capital in a few years, and they're going to want to see what I've done with it. And, so it's very all natural in terms of the incentives. And there's some things like that we can do that I think we're experimenting with at Azolla successfully about changing that model or pushing it or prodding it or making it extend in a different direction. But can that get at the whole of the impact that's being left on the table? I don't think, unless you come at it with a new set of capital constraints.
Yeah, someday I want to do a pod on what those alternative investing vehicles are.
Yeah, because everyone says venture's not the only path, and then you say, "Great, what are the other paths?"
Yeah. There's a lot of hand waving around that.
Yeah. I have more thoughts on that. We can keep talking about it. I kind of am assembling a group of people who want to figure this out, and I'm happy to keep in touch about it.
I mean, it comes up on this pod again and again and again and again. We just need capital that will hang out longer and accept lower returns over longer periods of time, basically. Like, that comes up over and over again.
Right. And as excited as I am about our model, and I think it's extraordinary, the premise is not quite that. We're taking higher risk.
Right.
But we don't think it's practical at this point, where there aren't other pools to draw from, to go after lower returns. There could be other capital that is suited for that, but we're saying, let us take on the highest risk right now. The risk that something might fail is higher.
Right.
But the potential that it has extraordinary impact is higher too. So let us underwrite that risk where other funds aren't able to go, and we'll get something ready for more mainstream VC.
Right. It would be nice, I mean, in some bright future, to have a funding ecosystem where there's a smoother sort of like, we'll help you on this bit, hand you off to these people who will help you through this bit. You know what I mean? It's a little scattershot right now. And
absolutely,
every company sort of wandering in the wilderness trying to assemble its own contract. But anyway, let's not get too diverted. Let's talk about mining.
Yeah, we should do that.
So share, as you see it, an overview of the mining challenge. And in particular, sort of which materials you have your eye on, either sort of as problems or as opportunities.
Yeah, sure. So at the highest level, the mining challenge stems from the fact that we're going to need a lot more of certain materials to enable the clean energy transition that we are striving for. And in terms of which materials, I will tell you top of that list are copper and lithium. And I would probably say copper even higher, because copper is the backbone of electricity. So whether you're talking about the grid, wind, solar, motors,
batteries,
electric vehicles, everything requires copper. And that is set against a background where, to meet clean energy demands that are forecast, the demand will double, which means we need to, some estimates say, double mining production and triple recycling, something like that. Ore grades are declining. So we've gotten the easy stuff already. The harder stuff is what's left. Permitting is really hard and takes forever.
Course.
And that's for some not so good reasons and some very good reasons, which is that the backdrop, as you know, of the mining industry is in many ways incredibly problematic in terms of environmental justice issues and siting.
Not a great record.
And so then you add, there are other things bound up in the copper ball, like because copper smelting, which is the majority of how we process copper today is incredibly hazardous to the environment using traditional techniques. We actually have closed down most of the copper smelters in the US, which is a good thing for people who breathe that air. But it also means that we are taking, copper mined in Arizona and we're offshoring it for refining and then sending it back, as refined copper or in products. And so that is challenging from a global supply chain risk standpoint, not to mention emissions associated with that transport. And so there's just a ton bound up with, okay, we need more copper, and then there's a long list of buts for why getting more copper is hard.
And more lithium. And just briefly, because I want to talk about copper a little bit more, but briefly, it's striking that you don't include, I think, what a lot of people think about when this comes up, which is these allegedly rare earth minerals. Like the word rare is so unfortunate in that term because people think that those are kind of the linchpin.
Well, it's rare earths are interesting, and we haven't invested in that area yet. We may, but you're right that they didn't top my list. So we're talking about things like neodymium, right? And the materials that go into magnets. And then depending on your definition, you may or may not be including, nickel and cobalt and manganese and other things that go into battery chemistries, which I put those in second tier only because, I think we have more tunability and flexibility in battery chemistries on the margins. But rare earth elements, to your point on the word rare, we are actually not at a global deficit on those, but 80% of the materials are in China. And so until recently, there was a risk, and now recently a reality that, China might withhold rare earth exports into the US. And that is what we're now seeing. And that, probably will upscale domestic efforts. But on the other hand, then there's always the possibility that China will flood the market and disrupt the pricing. And it's just incredibly fraught. That's why they didn't top my list.
For instance, China might withhold them if we slap them with 100% tariffs.
Just as a for instance.
I always think it's hilarious. We're like, what's China going to do? And then we just go punch China in the nose. We're like, yeah, they're going to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, our worst fears will come true if we go force them to come true.
Absolutely.
In the larger sort of policy community, there's all this concern about reshoring and all this concern about China dominating supply chains. Those are, though, economic security, political security, national security concerns. Do you adopt those? Is reshoring and securing supply chains part of something you think of as a goal of yours?
Not explicitly for that reason. I mean, we see geopolitical constraints and, risks as something that could hold back the clean energy industry as a whole. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, yes, but it is not a principal goal of our fund to specifically have a U.S., mineral supply, although we think it's a good idea for a lot of reasons, mm-hmm. In terms of having optionality. So I guess that's how I would thread that needle.
Yeah. Let's talk about copper then. And taking a kind of step back, I'm just sort of curious, as a VC, when you approach something like copper, you get these stats, we're going to need twice the copper ore, quality is declining, etc. Copper's a problem. How do you go about approaching that sector? Because I'm sort of all my training and the way I think about it is from a policy perspective. That's sort of how I think, but that's not your angle. So when you approach something like copper, are you going and looking for companies that are just getting started? Are you going to an area where you think there needs to be a company and sort of planting a flag and looking around and saying, hey, somebody come start a company here? What is a VC methodology when you approach something like copper?
Yeah, that's a great question because it is so wide open. So I'll say a couple things. One is that we tend to, just as a firm, we tend to seek opportunities both ways, both opportunistically, come one, come all. We kind of want to look at everything. And then we also do a lot of thesis-driven work. And in particular, an associate on our team, Cass Vickers, put together, a pretty comprehensive look at copper over the last couple of years in terms of, where should we be looking? Because of our unique vantage point in the venture investment scene, that also means we're looking, where are others funding already? We don't need to go there, but let's go where others are not funding. So to take one example of that, there's a process called heap leaching, where mining companies take degraded ores that are uneconomic assets, put them in a heap. It's called a heap, and they leach an acid through it. And there are companies like Jetty and Cybo who have been very well funded. It's very exciting, actually, for the sector that these companies have been well funded by climate tech VC, not us. And those are kind of novel leachates that they're putting into solution to get more out. We looked at that and we said, we're not really needed there. But guess what? This whole idea of a heap leach process is really a data-starved process overall. They're not distributing those assets correctly.
It's extremely analog. One might even say
analog.
Kind of gross.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and they don't even try, right? With the it's a heap leaching process.
Yeah, I know. It doesn't even they don't even try to disguise how gross it is.
So we invested in a company, just very, very pre-seed stage that, in many ways we partnered with hand in hand to just get a narrative together around, instrumenting that heap and being able to, I know, I'm trying to make it sound more glamorous and it's just not going to happen. And being able to, actually achieve the yield enhancements that should be possible if you're treating that like an instrumented asset, which it's traditionally not done. It's like an 18th century technique.
What was that one? It's called muon, right? It's a
muon vision.
They're shooting muons, which are what? Subatomic particles? What the heck are muons?
The universe is shooting muons. We don't have to do anything to get them. We just need to bury a scintillator under the heap and watch the muons come in and see how the liquid density is varying as a result.
So this is what it's telling you is where is the liquid in the heap coming down through? Where is it coming faster and slower? Where do you need more liquid? Basically, telling you a little bit about what's happening inside.
Exactly. And to put
heap.
this in yes, exactly. And to put this in the broader context, right, of the copper industry, you've got pyrometallurgy, which is the traditional way of kind of mining copper, hard rock mining, and you put it in a smelter and you go. There's more work to do there. And as mentioned earlier, that smelters are pretty bad. So there's more to do there. And we've actually made another investment on that side into a company called Stillbright. But the industry as a whole is actually wanting to shift more to what's called hydrometallurgical processing, which is how they might be able to get at some of these lower grade ores that aren't as much using the traditional methods, but they're going to need help to do that. And that's part of why we see, a lot of opportunity here.
And just broadly, we don't have to get too deep into it, but pyrometallurgy is basically you burn things to separate them, basically. You're trying to get something out of the material and you burn it off. Burn it with the presence of various chemicals.
You got it.
That separates it. Super dirty. Super energy intensive. Just like the iconic, unpleasant industrial process. It
is the iconic, unpleasant industrial process. It is the reason we barely have any smelters left in the U.S. That is a good thing. We just feel like we need alternatives.
But hydrometallurgy, just to orient people, is basically you are immersing the stuff in a solution of liquids that contain various chemicals that leach the materials apart, basically. So you don't require heat. I mean, basically it's like a room temperature process. Is that one of the big advantages?
You don't require heat, although it's interesting that you get more out if you do heat it. And so some companies are looking at, siting geothermal alongside heap leaching to, make it even better, but it kind of needs to be geothermal to make it worth it. You can imagine it's always, a spreadsheet exercise. But that's right. That's a good description. And, it should be said, just because I'm so focused on the environmental justice aspect of all this stuff, is that heap leaching is not, it's not some glorious alternative that doesn't touch people either. It takes up a lot of space and, it leaves behind an asset.
It's a giant pile of waste with acid running through it.
Exactly. Yeah. So, it's look, none of this stuff is what we might choose to do just for fun. It's all about what are the cost benefit trade-offs that we have to make if we decide we are prioritizing, and how do we minimize damage in doing that. And if I can just go to one other thought on, you had asked me, how do we think about scoping the space and how do we think about making investments? And as I was reflecting on the investments we've made, I realized something, which is that while the high level point to do any of this is what we started our conversation around, which is to enable the energy transition because we're going to need all these materials. That almost ignores this like big thing underneath, which is how emissions intensive all these processes are. And you went there on the smelting side, but we've actually, because when we make an investment, we underwrite not just to an eventual financial outcome that we know the financing sector will pay attention to, but we underwrite to a gigaton scale of impact. And we've decided to, when we do that underwriting, focus on the process emissions, not whatever downstream enablement and unlocking of a clean energy industry might occur. And I think that's important because it keeps us focused on making sure whatever we do, it has to be better than what's been done before.
Right. Although it is worth saying, just as a bit of information, that the emissions of the copper making process are relatively modest in the grand global scheme of things, especially compared to all the clean energy, technology that it enables. Like if you're going to spend emissions, like getting copper is pretty good.
Yeah, they are certainly modest in the scheme of what could be avoided and unlocked by the industries they are enabling. Otherwise, I hope we wouldn't be, even doing this. But they're not tiny. They're meaningful enough to clear our bar, which is a gigaton scale bar on process emissions alone, which in some cases I was surprised by.
Let me get into a few of the nooks and crannies of copper here. First, I want to talk about electrochemistry, because here at Volts, we love ourselves some electrochemistry. You mentioned a company that is using electrochemistry.
Still Bright.
Still Bright, yes.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about what they're doing and what it is substituting for.
Great. So we talked a little bit about the traditional pyrometallurgy and the smelting process. And so Still Bright is essentially taken out the smelting process, which is really awesome. So they are going after what's called chalcopyrite, which is part of the universe of sulfide ores that pyrometallurgy traditionally goes after, although chalcopyrite is generally considered a lower grade ore. So there's a lot of it lying around. And it's been challenging for smelters to extract copper from, not least because it's a dirtier, lower grade ore. And so when you put it through a smelter, it emits all sorts of nasty stuff, notably arsenic, which is like, could you think of a worse thing to be, gasifying and spreading into a community? And that is, one reason why it's just not done. But again, if we're going to meet this demand, we need to find clean ways to go after the ores that we do have. And so Still Bright this is a spin out from Columbia University, tremendous technology. They essentially react copper concentrate through a vanadium redox flow battery, and they're able to produce solid copper through that electrochemical process and have demonstrated pretty extraordinary efficiency. And they're going to market with the case that we can do processing of sulfide ores right here in the US, and we don't have to smelt them, and we're not going to emit anything.
So this is an alternative to smelting.
This is an alternative to smelting, which makes it pretty powerful.
Yeah, we can take these ores and produce copper with them on site, so you don't have to ship
You got it.
anything away for processing. And this is just a gleam in someone's eye. What's the state of it?
This is excitingly, a few steps beyond that. So a couple years ago it was, and John Vardner, who's the founder of this company, was kind of working on it after his PhD postdoc at Columbia University and realized he had a pretty powerful concept here. And so in the last couple of years, he spun that into a company. He got some preliminary funding from us and others. And he recently, I don't think it's been announced yet, but closed a pretty meaningful Series Seed round and is going to be building the first demonstration of this at a demonstration, but still meaningful non-lab scale. And that's going to be for the world to see within, about 18 months from now. So a lot of exciting things to watch there. And, they've seen really promising results in the lab. Of course, new engineering challenges do emerge when you take it up the next level. But the numbers that we're seeing are pretty promising. And, we're excited to be able to see that at the next scale.
Yeah, I'm so excited about electrochemistry. It seems like the solution to all the most difficult problems I've had. I've had someone who's making steel with electrochemistry on the pod, someone who's making concrete with electrochemistry, basically just substituting electrons for carbon molecules. What a beautiful thing. You just need a lot of cheap electrons.
To me, it is the most exciting way to interpret electrify everything, because
Yes.
it's just once you see it, you can't unsee it.
All the quote unquote difficult to abate sectors, electrochemistry is the answer in almost every one of those, I think, in the long term. We'll see.
And we've made a number of electrochemistry, focused investments, and the challenges are hard. Like the engineering really, truly is very hard, and don't want to dismiss that, but they are tractable. It's not an intractable set of challenges.
Interesting. And what about something I sometimes hear about, mining in situ, mining underground? Are you invested in that, and how the heck does that work?
Yeah, so we have not invested in that. I've sometimes heard that term apply to heap leaching, but I don't think that's what you mean. I think you might be referring to, there's an electrostimulation approach that we've seen. It's called ISR mining, where you can sort of stimulate to the surface the ore that you're after, but I don't know a ton about it. We haven't made an investment in that area.
And what about, there's two different methods of basically mining waste. One is mining what are called tailings.
Mm-hmm.
Are you getting involved in that, and how much promise is there in that? Because there's a lot of mining tailings laying around the world. Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who changed majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. And what about, there's two different methods of basically mining waste. One is mining what are called tailings. Mm-hmm. Are you getting involved in that, and how much promise is there in that? Because there's a lot of mining tailings laying around the world.
It is a huge opportunity. It is a tricky one to crack because typically the tailings are, what's left behind. And sometimes those are, inactive sites. And there's a question of who owns it and how do you get access. But putting that aside and just thinking about an active mining operation with tailings, there are some, we think about separations there. We think about, so another one of our portfolio companies, Citration, which has developed a silicon-based membrane that shows really tremendous selectivity for multiple of these elements that we care about, copper, lithium, and others. It can be tuned and be highly selective to not only size, but valence of the ion you're after. So some of these technologies that were actually, they have flexibility in how they can go to market in mining. You could think about them as technologies to deploy in the secondary, recovery market, which we didn't talk about yet, but we should do just a ton more of that because
we'll get there.
Yeah, because it's, what we can, it is maybe the one way we can avoid some of these most thorny community and justice issues. And then secondly, they could go to market, on the tailings front, which is, you have these waste streams on site at mines and you should be able to valorize them. And that's, it's in many ways, it's a variation of the heap leach concept. I have now what I have designated as uneconomic, or what previously, according to my prior technology toolkit, was uneconomic. And it's just a calculation of what's my ROI on bringing this new tool on board and whether I can reliably valorize what was previously written off as a waste stream. So there's quite a lot happening there. And also we talked briefly up top about the rare earth elements. I've seen a lot of companies going after mining tailings to find the little stuff. This might be a copper or a silver or a gold or a lithium mine, but there's other stuff in there. The Earth's crust is very interesting that way.
Yeah.
And so if you can find cheap enough ways to go get after it and recover, smaller amounts of still valuable materials, if you haven't invested all the upfront CapEx to mine those, the mining company did that for its main thing, but it can have secondary revenue streams. That's where we're seeing a lot of activity. And there's quite a bit of innovation on that front from, materials innovation, like the one I mentioned, to biological leaching, microbes that secrete kind of an especially effective leachate for some of these rare earth minerals. So there's quite a lot happening there.
And the other waste stream to mine that gets discussed, which I've always thought seems promising, is just landfills. Like people throw away a lot of metal,
Yeah.
a lot of processed pure metal in devices, and so little of that gets separated, so little of that gets recaptured. I just feel like we're in a world with tons of landfills with tons of valuable materials in them. But then I also think, like, what is the cost structure of schlepping through a landfill, picking out good stuff? Is that a reasonable thing that we are ever going to be able to do?
Well, I love that you went there. I was just on the phone yesterday with an entrepreneur who I was asking some of these questions to, not for the metal waste reason, but because she's working on, to keep at the heap topics, instrumenting landfills to find where RNG pipes might need to be rerouted to capture methane. But anyway, so I was asking some of these questions about, landfill economics and operations, and probably not a shock, but it's not like the most innovative sector. And so you can imagine sets of drone-based scanning or, AI-driven imagery deduction that's saying, well, look here, there's something promising, and, go send a robotic arm to pick it up and then send it through a line that can do some, visual analysis. And we have seen companies, by the way, doing that visual analysis of waste, not from landfills, but just online in recycling facilities. And so that technology is developing. And so I can certainly invent in my mind a future where what you describe is real, but it's probably not an especially soon thing. Although I will say that this is an area where I think in the US, we're pretty far behind Europe as an example, which is just people just, I think, care more about separating and the landfill setup, and actually innovation landscape in Europe is quite a bit more evolved from what I understand. So maybe we need to go over there first and see what our future looks like.
One thing I thought was interesting in your sort of like investment thesis document about copper was that you are going to steer clear for now of the seafloor stuff, which is a hot topic now because Trump, I don't know exactly what he did. It's just all these executive orders. I think at one point, it was either an executive order or a Truth Social post. It's hard to keep them distinct where he's like, yeah, go mine the seafloor. But you for now are staying away from that. What's the thinking there?
Well, and we haven't made, any definitive, we will never kind of statement about it. I will say we do talk to companies doing that. We find it interesting. As of yet, we haven't made an investment in that area. My thinking is maybe twofold. One is that we were talking earlier about how mining is a data-starved industry, and we were just talking about landfills where the same is true. And I think if you think about low-hanging fruit, there is quite a lot of it on land, or I guess out of the sea. And so in terms of just like where to focus time and energy and dollars, it hasn't been our focus. It would be reasonable for someone to make a different decision, but that's true as of now. And then secondly, we do a fair amount of active investing in ocean tech. It has tended toward, shipping and carbon removal. And so we know a little bit about, and I emphasize a little about maritime regulation and international waters and the complexities associated with that. And I think are under no illusions about, what would need to be sorted to responsibly and reliably do deep sea mining. And it's not to say that it's an intractable problem. It's just, again, like I'm always staring down the clock, I feel, at 2050 and thinking about what, this trade-off between we're a risk-embracing fund that can do really big swings, but we're increasingly hurtling toward some points of no return here. And so we have to make tough trade-offs about what is likely to come to fruition in time. Whew, that got dark.
Yeah, let's talk about a more pleasant topic, which is recycling. I think everybody holds out hope when they think about sort of the far future, that we can get to a place. I mean, this is the idea, right? Eventually we get to a place where we've mined enough and we are recycling and we've created something close to a closed loop, right? I mean, this is sort of like the dream.
The dream.
It's pretty far off, but how... I noticed sort of a note of caution about recycling in the document. So how are you thinking about recycling? Just, I mean, physically and environmentally, obviously it's a dire need, but in terms of like VC, targets, where do you find in there?
Well, we actually see a lot of activity. So I don't know if that note might have been referring to less critical need for catalytic capital. I would have to look back to see if that's maybe what it was referring to, but because there are a number of companies that are out there and doing a lot and, looking successful. Redwood Materials and lithium would be the prototypical example, Glencore, but there are others. And then we see emerging companies, and Cycle is a good example that I think are going to maybe give some of those a run for their money. And so there's some promising activity, and I think the revenue model is tough. It's a tough nut to crack, but again, probably a tractable one. And I think some of those founders and entrepreneurs are really paving the way to figure some of that out. But
there's some cool electrochemistry.
There's electrochemistry everywhere.
I know. Once you start seeing it.
Yeah. And I mentioned earlier Citration, who plays in that space. But I think recycling is so interesting because keep in mind for these mining and materials calls to action, it's still a little bit future looking. It's, over the next 10 years or out to 2030 or 2040, copper demand will double and lithium will quadruple or whatever it is.
But copper demand has not, you make a note of this in the document, copper demand has not gone up yet. So this is all...
It's all...
Probably.
It's all predicated on predictions, which are just that, right? So, well, I'll come back to that. But to finish the recycling, I think it's interesting. Let's assume for a moment that those predictions do come true. Mm-hmm. It's actually very hard to see permitting and the ores in the quality that they are really meeting that. And so the demand for secondary materials will probably skyrocket in a way that we don't yet feel today. And so I love those companies that are kind of getting ready for it because I think they're going to be really well positioned. It's just we're not feeling it yet. But to your point, this is all predictive and they're just that. And so it's kind of the strange thing that we're doing when we invest in this space. We're sort of warding off a future, what could be a lock in the future, but it's not an active unlock. And so one of the things I think about while this space is really important to me, and, I think there's a lot that can be done, especially to clean up, the mining industry in the scheme of climate tech investing. It's just one prong. And when it's an indirect prong that is predicated on a future thing, we're always weighing, how does that, when you compare that to, taking a molecule of methane right out of the atmosphere, how should we be weighing that, which is, doesn't have a simple answer, but it's an interesting question.
Yeah, a certain amount of skating to where you think the puck is going. You should talk to the people in the long duration storage crowd, those poor people where are hearing simultaneously, there's no current demand for your product, but don't you worry, in 10 years, there's going to be so much. It's sketchy. Tell us about lithium. So copper is the big one. I really don't feel like people get that, the need for more copper. So I'm glad we're highlighting that, but also lithium. And as a background to this question, This is also a general question about materials. So I've frequently, I've been doing this for 20 years now. You frequently hear like this or that material is rare. There's going to be exploding demand and there's not enough supply. There's going to be a giant choke point. It's going to stop everything. And like, it just inevitably never happens. Like somehow or other, we innovate or substitute around materials challenges. And so like all these projections of like in 10 years, X material is going to be $2 billion, dollars a pound, they just never come true, which seems to me makes it tricky to invest in this area. And so this brings us to lithium. Like you undoubtedly recall, it was not that long ago that people were saying lithium's price is skyrocketing. Everybody wants lithium. We're heading up to a giant lithium shortage that's going to grind the whole industry to a halt. And now lithium's like dirt cheap again.
Yeah, it's dirt cheap, but will it go back up?
Yes. Well, again, like who knows? So how do you think about that in terms of investing? Like, are we going to need a ton of lithium? Is it going to be cheap? Is it going to get scarce? How do you begin to approach that?
So that is totally true, that deep and staggering uncertainty, but that's no different than anything else we should be, looking at as good venture investors in terms of whether we're talking about, carbon markets or something even further afield. So I guess, there's comfort in that discomfort, but but I think your point is right. And the way we've thought about this, and we actually made our first lithium investment back in 2018, which is a long time ago, and not many people were talking about it. That was in Lilac Solutions, which is doing direct lithium extraction from brines. And then more recently, we invested in a company called Rock Zero, which is doing hard rock mining of lithium, which is sort of a different part of the landscape. But we think that there will be even if you don't get into the game of what exactly will the demand curve look like and when, what you can be pretty sure of, or at least I think so, is that if you have an extraordinarily better way of doing something, then you're going to be able to unlock value in that. And the market projections that may or may not come to pass are kind of unbounded upside on that. So that's a little bit about how we think of it. And we have to remember that this is a long game. And so it's, lithium prices crashing are unhelpful for a lithium company, out raising money during that time. But it's not probably a statement about yes or no on the long-term target. But I do value your point that we tend to find a way. And that's probably what is behind my statement about in the grand portfolio of technologies to be supporting. I think this has a role. I think it's a role that needs to be kept in balance to all the other problems we're chasing after for those of us who care about achieving this transition.
So then mining-wise, you guys are all over copper. You're in several early stage sort of improving copper mining. You're in a couple of lithium. Are there other mining? Is it just copper and lithium mostly? Like those are the big buckets? Are there others in this general area that you are excited about?
So in terms of investments that we've made, it's copper and lithium. And the company that's going after secondary extraction, titration that can be deployed across many materials. We've also looked at others. We may make other investments, but it's no accident that we've focused in on copper and lithium. And I displayed my bias up front that those are the two that are really most critical. I would say there are others that we'll, continue to look at. There are other companies, though, in our portfolio that touch on mining, even though they're not part of this critical or rare material conversation. And those, interestingly, tend to fall into the carbon removal space, where we're talking about, doing some form of enhanced rock weathering or accelerated weathering of limestone, where if those approaches are successful, and I'm thinking, in our case, companies, Calcaria going after decarbonizing shipping, and Vesta, which is doing coastal carbon capture, but there are many others, going after different iterations of that carbonate chemistry, basically. If those types of approaches are successful, there are some meaningful mining implications there too, in terms of where those materials are being sourced from, how they're transported, grinding costs, grinding emissions, and so forth. So it really does, I think, underline how foundational the mining industry is to a lot of what we care about, even if we don't always look directly at it.
Yeah. And I should make my point that I always make when mining comes up. It is true that clean energy technologies require more
Yep.
per unit of generation of these materials than fossil fuel energy generation technologies require.
Mm-hmm.
But what you don't have to do is mine a continuous supply of fossil fuels to dump into those machines. So you just need the materials once and then you're done, as opposed to needing fewer materials to build the machine, but then needing a continuous stream of fossil fuel to put in the machine, which does more landscape, social, whatever damage you want to, whatever kind of damage you want to talk about. Lots more being done by fossil fuel, digging up than there is by materials mining. So,
Right.
yes, more mining of these materials, but less overall disruption of the Earth's crust, let's say.
Right. But I'm so glad you brought up that point, because just the truth that there is more of these materials in the renewable energy and electric energy set.
Yeah.
It drives home the point that we have to do mining better. And I know we've said it, but I do worry about sometimes the conversation in climate tech around mining seems to be, just let's get more. And it's like, no, that just get more hasn't served us that well as a human race. So we have to do it better.
Yeah, well, there's two unproductive sides of that conversation, which I saw online when I threw this out there. One is just like, why are we worrying about these relatively modest impacts when the whole fate of the planet is online, blah, blah, just mine what you need to mine, et cetera. That's that attitude. And then there's the sort of like, mines are bad, they ruin communities, they ruin landscapes, let's get rid of them, just recycle.
Yeah.
I got that one thrown at me several times. And it's worth saying that, like, if you're going to need 2x the copper, even if you recycle 100x of the copper that you currently have,
you're going to need more.
You're not going to turn it into 200x. So, like, I'm just reinforcing your point. Like, there's a lot of mining needed, no matter which direction you face, no matter what you want to do. So you might as well do it better.
You might as well do it better, and you might as well kind of throw yourself into the learning of that. So if there's one thing that I would say that I've really benefited from, is kind of throwing myself headlong into what is hard about mining and not looking away from it, and talking to folks in the communities affected and visiting them. And that's what I advise portfolio companies to do when we make an investment, is like, go there and feel it and talk to people. So this is not academic for you, because if it's academic, you're going to make the wrong choice. You're not going to be able to fully value the complexity of what you're engaging in. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. Like, let's grapple with it, but let's grapple with it for real.
Yeah. Final-ish question. I think maybe energy in a way that is unlike sort of digital tech, which is the tech that everybody's kind of more familiar with, the kind of what they think of when they think about tech. Like, if you're developing apps, it's kind of Wild West. You can kind of do what you want. But in energy, everywhere you turn, there's policy. There's politics and policy that are incredibly relevant and germane to a lot of these industries. Like, depending on which way the policy winds blow, entire industries in this area can be sort of like created out of whole cloth or shut down.
Totally. I mean, I saw the announcement yesterday, coal designated as a critical material. No, I'm serious, because of metallurgical steel.
Hilarious.
Or metallurgical coal for steel. So yeah, there you go.
Yes, I know. So, but just like, my impression is from like the tech and investor community that they're like super informed on tech and tech risk and business risk, but maybe aren't super savvy when it comes to politics. Of course, I think that about everyone. I yell at everyone about that. But like, how do you think about policy risk? Is that a big column in your spreadsheet, or do you just sort of treat that like, acts of God that you can't, that you have no control over?
Are you asking for mining in particular, or for our investing practice in general?
Well, let's start with mining in particular, but I'm interested in the general answer too.
It's probably different between the two. So for mining in particular, I think by and large, in terms of the march of history and mining hopefully getting, better over time, currently laxing regulations notwithstanding, I think that in general, policy forces will be tailwinds for most companies innovating in this sector because they're, doing things better, cleaner, more efficiently. And that's where all the pressures over time are going to point things. So, there will be differences in terms of which geographies is that true in first. And by the way, there's a cautionary tale there because startup companies we often say, everyone needs to go fast, but in areas where there's kind of really heady, fraught issues, you sometimes need to go slower now in order to go faster later. And so don't go necessarily to the place to deploy where you have the most lax regulations, right? So either apply more strict regulations to yourself elsewhere, or actually start in a place with stricter regulations so that you have kind of a squeaky clean reputation from the start. So that's just kind of a side note of the playbook. But I think in general, the policy factors will be tailwinds for startup companies in the sector generally. And I guess that does map to how we think about policy risk more generally at Azolla, which is we both eschew and totally welcome policy risk on different timescales. So on the near-term timescale, what we probably will never do is underwrite an investment that requires a subsidy of any kind to be economic.
Interesting.
Because it's not reliable and it's not durable and it's not the way we think people are incentivized. And it's just not the political system that we've seen. But in the longer term, we have made a declaration that in certain cases, policy will land. We may not know the specifics, but we know that in the arc of time, mining regulations will tighten or regulatory carbon markets will grow. That kind of macro confidence we do sometimes have about the policy environment. And
the arc of history bends towards justice, you might?
Yeah, there we go. That's absolutely.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. I mean, and in a certain sense, like if it isn't,
we have bigger problems.
We're all screwed anyway. So you might as well fill your time with something.
That's right.
Mining, as you say, as I think everyone acknowledges, globally, mining is a grim, not just grim physically, but like the industry has a terrible record. It's been rapacious. It's destroyed a lot of landscapes, destroyed a lot of communities, and has a sort of established a history of we're going to do the cheapest thing, come what may. So I guess just like an actual final question, which is just like, until and unless these things you're investing in become cheaper than the alternatives, do we have any reason to believe that the mining industry is going to make sort of good faith efforts, that they will spend extra money to clean themselves up? Or they're just going to, you know what I mean? In some sense, you almost need policy to force them to clean up to make these things you're investing in viable. Do you know what I'm saying?
So, I mean, look, good faith efforts, probably. I mean, I think that there are good people who work on the community engagement sides of mining companies that are kind of trying to do the right, like, I really believe that. And, you look and you learn about the programs going on at, say, the Resolution copper mine in Arizona, which has met with a lot of challenges. And they're not doing negative things in the community alongside the mine. They're doing positive things. How does that weigh? Well, the community should decide. But just to say that there are good faith efforts, but I would say good faith efforts are probably not enough. And so I just agree with your actual, conclusion that you probably need policy to force it. And that's because every incentive, by the way, for a mining company is to kind of promise the world. And then it's actually very, very hard to deliver the world because reality intervenes. And so you're just like setting up for this huge disparate outcome in terms of what the vision was and what the reality was. But I do think that policy and regulation is totally critical here because I don't think mining companies really have the incentive to go as far as absolutely possible, which is what's necessary. It's not necessary to do a little bit more here or there. And then maybe final thought here, and this is where I'm going to start to sound like an optimist, which is that these companies that we support and others support and that are bringing in many ways the new front of mining technology, whether that's, cleaner or more efficient or more intelligent, they actually have an extraordinary opportunity to sort of demand a different set of behaviors from the mining companies that will be their customers if their technologies prove successful. And so if you have the most promising electrochemical approach to refining copper, and you are licensing that out or deciding where to site your facility, you are going to call the shots. Now, the startup companies that are developing those technologies today, they're not yet in a position to call the shots, but if they are successful, they will be. And that's why, to me, it's so important to kind of from the start think about what kind of business are you trying to build and what is the change that you might be able to demand just by dint of having a better solution.
Yeah, the landscape looks different when there's no other way of doing it but the bad way. Like the minute there's a different way of doing it, even if the new way is more expensive, the whole sort of like social and political landscape shifts.
That's right. But I think, for a lot of these companies, the new way of doing it won't be more expensive. It's actually a win on many levels.
Well, your lips to God's ears. All right. Well, Johanna, thank you so much. It's really fascinating. I'm glad you've dived into this sometimes unpleasant area. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Had a lot of fun. Thanks for the discussion.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.